Guten Morgen. Welcome to the first edition of Cut to the Chase. Solutions to make the backbone of America, small business, stronger, more effective, and a bit more nimble. Today, we're taking on dealing with the red tape of starting your own business. Welcome to the table. Gentlemen, welcome back to the table. It's good to see you here again. And today we're going to be looking at paperwork, bureaucracy, and how it affects small business. So tell us, why don't you give us a quick intro here on what you have to do to start a business?
That's a really good question. It really depends on where you are, what business you're trying to start. When I was in California and I attempted to incorporate a business, I had to fill out a paper form and mail it in with a check. This was in 2014. Then I moved to Colorado and I found out that I just had to go to a website and do everything that would have taken me several days to do in California in a matter of 30 minutes. So it really does depend on where you're locating your business. And I was very impressed with the way Colorado has made it very streamlined.
But it also depends, of course, on what type of business you're starting, right? Different businesses have different levels of certification and regulation, which may be good, right? You want to know that someone who's, doing something to you, a medical professional, et cetera, is properly certified. But I think as we learned in COVID, and this is an interesting thing to get kind of your all's perspective on, perhaps some of those regulations didn't quite make sense, at least as it related to how those regulations travel or how your certifications travel, right? The fact that someone who started their nail salon in California couldn't come to Colorado and do the same thing without recertifying doesn't really make a lot of sense. Not that they shouldn't have to reincorporate a business or incorporate a local business, paying local taxes, all of those sorts of things you need to apply for. That all makes sense. But we realized, I think, in COVID just how unmobile, if that's a word, but unmobile we've made so many business sectors because of these regulatory overlays that don't really make sense.
If I had a small business, say here in Colorado, and I wanted to say for some very unknown reason, move to Alabama, I might have to go through a whole load of recertification again, depending on exactly the type of business I am?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of differences between the states. I mean, look at nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Depending on what state you're in, those professions could either prescribe medications or do procedures or not be able to.
There are some things that relate to local control that make a lot of sense. And I think Colorado is a great example of that. I think we've had a number of things that have come up over COVID, and I think Governor Polis has correctly decided to defer to local municipalities to make some of those local decisions. But there are other things that don't really make sense. Why some of that licensure can't travel. And a lot of people probably experience this personally during COVID, right? You could finally get your doctor on the phone no matter what state you were calling from. But the truth is that we don't allow that in normal times, right? And we're back to normal times. And so there's more of a lockdown on those sorts of things. And so, I think we need to find the right balance of those things that should have local control with other things where local control just creates just a fly trap of overhang and regulatory challenges that don't need to exist. They're not actually making consumers safer. They're making it harder for people to move their business from one place to another. And by the way, I would point out many of the types of businesses that have particularly onerous licensure requirements are businesses that are run by people of color, by people that may be slightly lower on the income scale. And so it's really regressive in that sense. And that's, I think that's problematic. In the New Builders, we talk a lot about local business, right? And the book is about the next generation of entrepreneurship, all of the different type of people that are starting businesses, local businesses like your business. And I think one of the things that we try to do is we try to paint a picture of just how powerful those businesses are, but some of the obstacles that they face in terms of financing, in terms of getting started. And I think what we're describing here today fall into that category of obstacles, right? We make it too hard for people to get started because we put these blocks in front of them. And what we're really saying, I think, is we want to minimize those within reason, right? Health, safety, worker safety, et cetera. That's all very important. But we'd like to minimize the obstacles that are in front of new builders and others that are starting businesses.
Yeah, we're not just talking about scalable businesses, but all businesses, right?
Yeah, I mean, really, we're talking about the power of local businesses, right? You talked about service businesses. You described your dance studio. I mean, really, those are the type of businesses that are the engine of the United States economy, right? 50% of employment, 40% of GDP are derived from businesses that are small businesses that don't necessarily have a goal of becoming large. They have a goal of being a thriving business, right? And employing people and providing a good life for their owners. And I think that that's something we sometimes miss in the conversation, where when people are talking about regulations, they often have in their mind big businesses, right? But big businesses are affected, of course, by regulations and are subject to them. But small businesses are as well, and they're less able to cope with those regulatory overlays because they don't have staffs of lawyers and other people, right? When you have a code that you have to follow, you're the one who's saying, okay, what is the code and what do I need to do?
Right.
Not some sort of bevy of lawyers. So I think that's something that's really important to remember, that the vast majority by number of businesses that are affected by all sorts of regulations and regulatory overlays, they're small businesses.
I find that a little bit strange because they're the people that you really want to help the most.
I don't know why we don't want to empower people to start businesses as
absolutely.
easily and quickly as possible. And again, safely. But if I have been certified to cut hair in Alabama, to keep with your example, but to reverse it, and I want to move to Colorado, I don't understand why I should have to recertify. Not that I shouldn't have to, again, get my business license. Not that I shouldn't have to show my certification from Alabama, et cetera. Like, I'm not suggesting that anyone could just set up shop. But once I have that certification, why would I have to redo that in Colorado? Sometimes that could be expensive. You're already moving. That's expensive. It doesn't make sense to me that that's the overlay that we put on top of many of these businesses.
I completely agree, and your book, New Builders, really illustrates that well. I think that with the U.S. being a continuous block of free transit, I think that it just makes more sense for it to be, if I wanted to move to Alabama because of an economic opportunity, I should be able to and move my licenses along with me, because that would just allow more people the opportunity to go somewhere where their skills would be more valuable.
By the way, we already do that. If I move to Alabama, I can go to the Department of Motor Vehicles in Alabama, give them my Colorado license, and get an Alabama license.
I wonder if just local politics and fiefdoms are really the problem. Because it's kind of like, people like Colorado, taking it as an example. Oh, we don't want to take a doctor's license from such and such other state because they're not at the same level that we are. And that's certainly understandable, especially in high-skilled areas where basically what you are providing in your business is your skill level.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there are different qualifications at different places, but perhaps a more nationalized system of qualifications could be helpful. What do you think, Seth?
That's interesting. If you take, medical profession, for example,
right.
Nurses can transfer their licenses from certain states to other states, but not from, those other states back,
Exactly.
right? Which is interesting. And so, I mean, to me, that speaks. I mean, it's true in law. It's true. Law is a little different because obviously each state has a separate set of laws. So there's reasons why people need to be competent in their state laws, at least if they're going to practice in areas that touch state law. But it does speak potentially in some of these areas to a national certification. What it takes to be a nurse we'll keep with our Alabama, Colorado example, in Alabama and Birmingham shouldn't be different than what it takes to be a nurse in Denver. And once I've proven that, it should transfer both directions. It shouldn't be that, hey, California has a particularly rigorous nurse practitioner exam, and so every other state accepts that, but some other state doesn't have as rigorous an exam, and California won't accept it because of that. Like, that doesn't make any sense. They should all be at the same level.
I think this is what actually confuses the rest of the world about America. As Marty Feldman always used to call it, the untied states of America. It makes no sense.
But you have to remember, the United States didn't, the concept of states didn't exist, right? Like, each colony was a separate company.
Yes.
I mean, they were literally separate legal entities chartered by the crown, right? And that history then translated into all of the sort of forming of the United States, and that was part of the sort of grand bargain in the Continental Congress of how do we balance individual states' rights with collective rights, right? And so we've always had this sort of duality as a society that I agree it's probably pretty hard to understand if you're not from here. Even when you are from here, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But that's this kind of strange history that we have.
Dwayne, you're a small business owner. Do you agree with everything they've said?
Well, number one, we are local. We've never had to transfer from one state to another state. And one of the things that does happen with a lot of businesses, especially small service businesses, your business is really the relationships that you have. Business is such a central element of our society. I've always told people, if you want to influence a society, start a business and run it exactly the way the values you treasure and what you think. And if you can stay in business doing that, there you go. You've influenced the society because you're doing it with the actions that you're taking. And there's always going to be problems with regulation because regulation, there's different levels, different places. You know, we have the different states. The kind of regulations that are made are usually made to deal with an egregious situation. Somebody has done something horrific. And so now there's the emphasis and the human cry for, we need to do something about it. So the kind of stuff that they do is to address this really super egregious problem. Now, does that scale to everybody else who's doing something similar to that? Maybe, maybe not. And so what we need to have is the ability to be able to make decisions and choices that come as close to the problem as possible. And that's why we have municipalities, we have counties, we have states, we have the federal government. At each one of those levels, it's always just a matter of personal integrity, personal acumen. The people who are involved in it, it's a social, it's a societal kind of thing. And business from my point of view, it's a very social activity. I mean, you're dealing with people. That's the whole point.
I think the challenge is what decisions should be local versus what decisions should not. So take building codes, for example,
Yep,
right?
yep.
There are different soils, different weather conditions, flood proclivities, et cetera, in different places. So sort of we understand there should be different building codes. Different municipalities maybe have different goals for energy efficiency, for longevity of structures and things like that. So that we've said, okay, well that could be local, but there are other things that shouldn't necessarily be sort of hyper local in their decision making, right? That relate to
Right.
all the licensure stuff we talked about, things of that nature. Where once you've been certified, like why shouldn't you be certified everywhere? So I think there's a balance here, and I think it depends. Bright people can disagree on which things should be controlled locally. We're clearly in the United States right now. We're on a little bit of a tack towards more and more local control. But then you can create patchworks, and this is what you're describing, your friends not really understanding, these patchworks of laws and regulations that don't make any sense. I need to know as a human that I can, whatever. When I pay taxes to the federal government, that means the same thing in one state as it means in another state. I'm trying to choose something that's not controversial. But there's all sorts of things that people can think about that are on the docket these days that are quite controversial, where one of the things that we had said as a country is, hey, there's a category of things that actually we believe to be national in scope, and we want everyone everywhere in the United States to be subject to the same.
Right.
And there's separate things that should be at local control, and we're just arguing now over which of those things are local and which of those are national. In the case of the national debate, we're generally talking about state control versus federal control. But here at the table, we're talking about sort of hyper-local control, right? Municipalities, cities, towns. What should they control versus what should someone else control? For example, if you own a restaurant in Longmont, Colorado, where we are, I don't think your health and food standards should be any different than a restaurant in some other, New York City, let's say, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the same, right? Edible food is edible food, and should be subject to the same. The enforcement might be local, but the regulation should be global.
And two, you have to remember too that many times regulations represent competing values.
Yeah.
It's like somebody will say, oh, well, we need to have carbon neutral by such and such a date. And somebody else will say, oh, no. We need to make sure that people can afford to get to work.
Well, you bring up a good point, right? It's like, how are you able to do a system that is consistent while still giving the individual localities their autonomy? Gun regulations is a good way a good thing to discuss within that context. Environmental is a good thing to discuss within that context. Health-related things are another thing that would be within that same scope. So I think it really does depend on what the topic is. But it does require smart people like us sitting around and talking about it.
And debating it.
I actually got caught out, kind of funnily, the first week of living in America. Where I was stationed in Massachusetts, Bedford area, you could go along to a bar, you could buy a beer at the bar, you could walk down, you could sit down at the table, drink your beer. No problem. Well, one night we all went out to Woburn. Different laws. I order my beer. I pick up my beer. I turn around to walk to the table, and the next thing I know, I've got a policeman jumping all over me because in Woburn that was illegal. You can understand.
And who's to know? Yeah.
You can whether it still is or not. It's one of those blue laws that has carried on, and most of Massachusetts have got rid of it, except in Woburn. How daft is this? Now let's get back on subject. What you have said is all very interesting, but how do franchises fit into this particular? Supposing Dwayne decides, you know what, Dance Dimensions, I'm going to open that up as a franchise, and I'm going to be selling it as a franchise, and he finds a buyer to buy the franchise up in Cheyenne. What happens in that sort of situation? Because everywhere being different, franchises must run into a hell of a lot of problems.
Well, the idea behind a franchise, obviously, is to take something and have it be substantially the same everywhere you put it. And of course, that's to have it be exactly the same is an unrealistic goal, because if you're going to put it in disparate locations, you are going to be subject to different building codes, different regulations.
Mind
and
you,
things like
Walgreens seems to be able to manage it.
Well, it's not that you can't figure it out, but you might have to do slightly different things. Now, again, we're talking about a reasonableness test here, and I think the role of local government, role of local and state government as it relates to this topic should be to encourage people to open more businesses, to be able to facilitate risk-taking, and to do so in a way that provides reasonable safety and security for the public, but without being onerous. And so I think just as a general rule, that's what we should be striving for. And I think that's ultimately what all three of us are saying, is that we recognize that there needs to be some level of local control over certain decisions, but we've kind of gotten a little crazy with that, and we probably need to loosen up the reins a little bit, especially as it relates to some of the things that we learned through COVID, and even just to pick on a couple of local regulations. And I think Boulder and Longmont, as examples, are engaging in real conversations about this. We kind of threw out the code book as it related to restaurants operating on city streets. Probably went a bit too far on that, but it was understandable. I'm not saying we shouldn't have done that, but people really liked that, and it made us rethink, why are we so restrictive about some of these things, right? Your beer example, right? The west end of Pearl Street, they decided you could carry your beer around, right? It was okay. I think Boulder is seriously thinking about creating some zones where that's okay, and restaurants can operate outdoors. Now, I think they're appropriately saying, hey, we need to make sure that those areas have access, that people that are providing outdoor seating areas that include electricity and things like that, but it's been put up in a way that's not a safety hazard. But that's an example of maybe changing the way we think about the regulatory overlay.
I fully support that. However, some poor tourist lands at DIA, goes to Boulder, goes out for a beer, discovers he can walk around with it, then goes up to Breckenridge, and the first thing that happens is he's arrested. That's wrong.
He should know better.
He's a tourist.
Well, we were talking about this off camera before we came on, but talk about like a great example of local autonomy, right? Like there should be if the goal of Breckenridge is, hey, we don't want people walking around with open alcohol, understood, then the enforcement of that shouldn't be so rigid that policeman can't actually say, hey, I'm just telling you this is how it is up here, and we're going to throw that out. And understanding that you were from, when they explained it to them, hey, you were just in Boulder, and this was allowed, right? Or but that might mean signage, things like that. In the case of open containers, I think it should just be allowed. Having been in Germany recently, where you could just go buy your Wiener Schnitzel and
Anywhere in Europe.
yeah,
Absolutely
and just
anywhere.
carry your beer out, and it's fine. People are,
We are in 100% agreement on that.
free your beer.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you guys bring up really good points. I mean, we want consistency because you don't want to have people who are surprised and the tourist example. I mean, no one wants to be in that situation.
It's tough though, right? Because from my perspective, I feel like that's a reasonable local ordinance, right? It's reasonable for different locations to decide differently about open container carry like that.
A good example is New York and marijuana. I visited New York recently, and I saw a lot of people just smoking weed on the street. And I'm like, I'm from Colorado. Like, we're one of the first places to legalize marijuana, right? And we don't have that. And so I was talking to someone. I'm like, so what's the difference? Why do you guys have people just smoking around in the streets? Like, you guys don't have regulations or something? They're like, no, the opposite. They don't allow people to smoke in their apartments because it's such a cramped living situation. It only makes sense for them to go smoke outside because you don't want to smoke up the whole building, right?
Right.
And I'm like, oh, duh, that makes sense now that you explained it to me. But that's a good example of how things may work well in one place, but not
necessarily in another.
Yeah, exactly.
That is interesting.
And
I hadn't heard that. Sorry, Dwayne.
And then the discretion of how to enforce these rules, I think, should be given reasonably as possible, as close to the situation as you can get.
That's a good point. I mean, the closer someone is to a situation, the better insights they have. I mean, they teach you that in Six Sigma and process improvement, right? You have to understand what the job is, what the stakeholders do, and then you can prescribe fixes, right?
So the whole Japanese style
Exactly.
of management, right?
Exactly.
I mean, the janitor or the production line worker has actually a better sense for what would make their job easier than management does. So yeah, totally agree with that.
Regulations, I think many times, they really represent many times, I think, competing values. And many times people who, quote unquote, are like large businesses will get on a high horse about some particular thing, and there's probably good reason that they have come in conflict with somebody else who is higher up in government, and those are almost intractable from at that level because of the two personalities that are involved. But I think that exactly what we're doing here is the perfect solution. It is talking about it and saying, because I'm sure if we talked long enough, we would come to some situation where we'd say, I think this, and Tallis would say, no, I think that. But having those conversations where we, localize where our differences are at, and then work through them and say, oh, I understand where you're coming from, I just don't think it's right. And likewise, vice versa. And then we say, well, what can we do to make it work? And I think that's really what we have to be thinking about for how we regulate business and how we, quote unquote, in a broader sense, do our politics.
Right.
But it starts with the conversation. I mean, if you don't have the conversation, if we're not talking to one another, we have to talk about difficult things. Right now, what we're talking about, oh, this is easy, no problem. We're all pretty much in agreement. But we need to get down to those things where we don't agree. And the three of us, or four of us, we may agree on most everything. So we may not ever come into that situation. So we need to go out and to find, and hopefully, being on a show like this, we can find somebody else who's out there who disagrees with what's going on here, and they can come and be part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Well, the danger in our current political environment is that we've lost that trust and the ability to have the conversation, right?
Yep.
And of course, as Reagan famously said, or quoted a Russian poet who famously said, trust but verify, right? And that's really what the goal of regulation should be, right? It provides a framework so people know how they're supposed to operate, but it also provides the framework for verifying whether they're operating that way, right?
Right.
I don't want to just trust that restaurant owner that they've complied with health and safety regulations. I like the fact that someone goes in from time to time and says, show me your cold storage, and takes the temperature, and show me your your cleaning procedures and things like that. So I think everything we're talking about requires both some level of trust and some conversation, and in particular, I think changing the way that we approach the regulatory framework requires that, right? Because I think we've kind of gotten to this polarized, like, one group says, hey, all regulations are good, we should regulate. Another side says all regulations are bad, we should not have any regulation. Neither of those is even remotely right, and neither of the people that are saying those could possibly actually agree with that if they really sort of were taken through the math of it. And so I think we need to spend a little bit, it might be a pipe dream at this point, but spend a little bit more time trying to build those bridges, because it's a very toxic environment in order to have those conversations. Because when I say I think there should be less regulation, I'm not saying I think that people shouldn't be safe, right? Just in the same way as when I'm saying, hey, I actually think local municipalities should be able to say whether they want people carrying beer around, doesn't mean I don't trust you to carry a beer around, just means that people in the good people of Breckenridge could decide differently than the good people of Longmont.
I agree with these two fine gentlemen. I think that regulations are something that should be thoughtful. In my opinion, I think that regulations should be designed to be harm reduction. And that's not just like personal harm, but like economic harm. We should make sure that our regulations are designed to optimize the situation for businesses and optimize the situation for living experience for the residents of the community. But I agree. I think that too much regulations puts people and businesses in situations that cause additional harm. So has to be a happy medium. But I mean, coming up with that is the difficult part, right? I mean, understanding what's too much and what's not enough. That's why we have elected officials that hopefully are.
That's why we need people like you.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Council, right?
I appreciate it, sir. Thank you.
This has been a fascinating little conversation, and it's interesting that actually all three of you are pretty much in the same ballpark when it comes to your ideas, but you are 100% correct. I'd love to get someone to come in here and actually disagree with you. And let's see if we can find that middle ground, because there is always a middle ground. And unfortunately, that's something that America seems to have forgotten at the moment.
But I think there's also the thing, too, there are people who profit off of making sure that people disagree.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree
and
more.
Just working it.
I do want to point out one thing. I don't think any of us are lawyers, right?
Right.
Correct.
So that might have something to do with the fact that we all can find common ground, and then we aren't going overboard in terms of regulations.
Remember, lawyers always want to have as many laws on the books as possible.
Yeah, because that's how they make more money.
That's how they make more money. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today at the table. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Nigel Aves, your host. This was Cut to the Chase, signing off. Thank you.